In the late summer of 1903, a small trading vessel left the port of Heraklion on the northern coast of Crete. It was not a remarkable departure. The ship, a wooden cargo vessel of modest size, was loaded with dried goods, olive oil, and tools intended for smaller island settlements further west. The crew numbered 11 men. Most of them had been sailing these waters for the better part of their adult lives. The Mediterranean was not a mystery to them. It was a place of work. The captain, a man in his early 50s whose name appears in surviving port records only by surname Valles, had been running supply routes between Crete, Santorini, and several smaller Cycladic islands for nearly 2 decades. The route was well established. There were no unusual conditions forecast. The winds were cooperative, the seas were moderate, and the calendar was working in their favor. Late summer in the Aegean carries long, clear days and nights that are warm enough to make open water bearable. It was precisely the kind of voyage a crew stops paying close attention to, because nothing about it demands attention. The men aboard were not storytellers in any romantic sense. The accounts we have of what happened on this voyage come primarily from 2 sources: a brief and carefully worded entry in the ship's logbook, and a separate written testimony given by one crew member, a younger sailor named Petros, approximately 3 weeks after the voyage concluded. Petros was not a superstitious man by the accounts of those who knew him. He had grown up near the docks in Heraklion and had begun working on cargo vessels at the age of 14. By 1903, he was 26, and he had seen enough of the sea to know that it produced strange things without any help from mythology. It is worth stating clearly what kind of men these were, because the nature of what they reported later only holds weight if we understand who was doing the reporting. These were not men who leaned toward embellishment. Their world was measured in cargo weight, weather patterns, and the condition of rigging. Superstition existed in their community, as it does in most maritime cultures, but the men on this particular crew seem, by most indications, to have been the practical sort. Several of them had families ashore. Several had made this exact route before. None of them, as far as the records suggest, had ever reported anything unusual on the water before this voyage. The ship left Heraklion in the early morning, when the sky was still gray and the harbor was filling with the ordinary noise of a working port. The course was set northwest, skirting the lower edge of the Cyclades before turning toward the smaller islands where the cargo was destined. The first day passed without incident. The crew worked, ate, maintained the vessel, and rested in shifts. The sea behaved as the sea was expected to behave. There was nothing in the first several hours of that voyage to suggest that any of them would return home changed in any way by the experience. By the second evening, they had entered a stretch of open water that sits between several largely uninhabited islands in the southern Aegean. The water there is deep and relatively still in the late summer months. There are no significant shipping lanes through that particular corridor, and the crew was passing through it simply because it was the most direct path. They had done so before. There was no reason, by any practical measure, to think about the water beneath them any more than they would think about the road beneath a cart. Nothing unusual was expected. And then, sometime after midnight, the first sound carried across the water. The night was quiet in the way that open water is quiet when there is no wind. Not silent, because the sea is never truly silent, but settled. The rigging was still. The surface of the water moved in long, slow swells. Several crew members were asleep below deck. A small watch rotation was maintained on deck, as was standard practice. Petros was among those on watch that night. In his written testimony, he describes the moment clearly enough that it reads less like recollection and more like someone working hard to explain something they still do not fully understand. He says that the sound arrived without warning and without obvious direction. It was, in his words, like hearing someone singing in another room of a house. Present, recognizable, but not locatable. He first assumed it was a man on his own crew, perhaps one of the younger sailors who sometimes hummed while working. He looked around and saw that the other men on watch were quiet and occupied. The sound was not coming from anyone on deck. The singing, if that is the right word for it, was not dramatic. This is worth emphasizing. There was nothing in the first moments of the sound that caused alarm. It was melodic in quality, high in register, and carried something that Petros described as a kind of slowness. Not slow in tempo exactly, but slow in the way it moved between notes, as if the notes themselves were being stretched rather than performed. He stood and listened for a moment before saying anything to the other men on watch. He wanted to be certain he was actually hearing it. When he mentioned it to the man nearest him, that sailor paused, tilted his head, and then nodded. He had heard it too, and had assumed Petros was the source. Both of them stood quietly and listened. The third man on watch, when prompted, confirmed the same. He had been hearing it for several minutes and had not mentioned it because he had assumed the other two were responsible. The natural conclusion, arrived at quickly by all three men, was that another vessel was nearby. A fishing boat perhaps, or another small cargo ship passing on an adjacent heading. It would not have been unusual in those waters to hear voices or music carrying across the surface at night. Sound travels differently over open water, particularly in still conditions. The men agreed on this explanation, and one of them walked to the railing and looked out. There were no lights on the water in any direction. The sky was clear and offered enough starlight to see a reasonable distance. There was no silhouette, no lantern, no running light. Nothing that suggested a vessel of any size within range of the sound. The man at the railing stood for a while and continued looking. He called back to the others that he could see nothing. They did not panic. They discussed the sound quietly, leaning toward the simple explanation that the acoustics of the area were causing them to hear something from a much greater distance than expected, perhaps a vessel that was already out of visual range. This is a phenomenon that sailors in those waters would have been at least casually familiar with. Sound over still water is unpredictable. But then the wind shifted, just slightly, and the sound shifted with it, moving from somewhere off the port side to somewhere behind the ship, as if its source was not stationary. A fixed vessel, no matter how far away, does not move like that, and a moving vessel would have carried a light. When the crew attempted to locate the source, the sound changed. The captain was woken sometime before 2 a.m. This detail appears in the logbook, noted with the kind of flat brevity that captains use when recording things they are not sure how to classify. The entry reads, in translation, unusual sound reported by watch. Course unchanged. Investigated. No source identified. That is all Valles wrote about it in the moment. It is a minimal entry, but the fact that he wrote anything at all is notable. Captains on routine cargo runs rarely annotate the logbook with sound reports unless something about those sounds concerns them. When Valles came on deck, the singing was still audible. He listened to it for a period that Petros estimated at several minutes, standing at the rail with his arms at his sides, saying nothing. Then he asked, without addressing anyone in particular, whether the sound had changed at all since it was first noticed. Petros told him it had. It had moved. Valles nodded and did not say anything further for a while. What happened over the next hour was gradual, and that gradual quality is part of what makes the account unsettling in retrospect. The sound did not intensify suddenly. It grew clearer. There is a difference. Intensity suggests volume. Clarity suggests proximity. The singing was becoming easier to hear, not because it was getting louder, but because it seemed to be getting closer to the point of origin, as if whatever was producing it was no longer at a distance. Several other crew members had come up from below, roused either by the watch or by some instinct that something on the ship had changed. By this point, the sound was audible to everyone on deck. It remained melodic, remained high, and remained difficult to identify as having any single clear direction. When men moved from one side of the ship to the other, the sound seemed to follow, or rather, it seemed to redistribute itself so that it was always coming from the side of the water nearest to whichever man was listening. Petros noted this in his testimony with particular care. He described walking from the port railing to the starboard railing twice in a row, and both times the singing seemed to drift toward him. There was also the water itself. By the time the full crew was awake, several men had noticed that the surface immediately around the vessel was unusually flat. Not dangerously so, and not in a way that felt supernatural in isolation, but enough that one of the older sailors, a man named Konstantinos who had been sailing for 30 years, remarked on it. The broader sea continued to move in its normal low swells. But within perhaps 20 or 30 meters of the hull on all sides, the water was glassy and still. Konstantinos said it reminded him of the water directly behind a reef, where the swell breaks before it arrives. Except there was no reef. There was nothing beneath them at that point that would account for the calming of the surface. The birds were gone. This detail appears in both the logbook and in Petros's testimony, and it was the one that seemed to disturb the older sailors more than the sound did. Seabirds are a constant presence in the Aegean, even at night, even in open water. They roost on passing vessels, they circle in the thermals above shipping corridors, and they call in the dark. But the men noticed at some point during that hour that there was nothing. No calls, no shapes against the stars, no birds landing on the rigging. Just the ship, and the still water, and the singing from no visible source. The crew remained on deck. No one went back below. They did not speak much to one another, but they stayed together, close to the center of the ship, away from the railings. Then someone saw movement beneath the surface. It was Konstantinos who first pointed it out. He was standing near the bow, looking down at the flat water just ahead of the hull, and he called back to the others in a low voice. Not a shout, not alarm, just the tone of a man asking someone else to confirm what he was seeing. Petros was among the first to walk forward and look. The water was dark, as deep ocean water is dark at night, but the starlight reflected off the flat surface well enough that the top few feet were not entirely opaque. What Konstantinos was pointing at was a shape. A pale shape, elongated, moving just below the surface alongside the starboard bow. It was not moving quickly. It was moving at approximately the same speed as the vessel, keeping pace, and it was oriented lengthwise, parallel to the hull. Petros writes that his first thought was that it was a large fish. The Mediterranean does carry sizable marine life, and pale fish near the surface are not unheard of. But he says that what prevented him from accepting that explanation, even in the first moment, was the shape of the thing. It was too long, and in the wrong places it was too wide. He could not see it clearly enough to describe it with certainty. He was clear about that in his testimony. But what he could say was that the shape did not move the way a fish moves. It did not undulate. It did not use its tail. It moved, he said, the way a swimmer moves when they are drifting just below the surface, not actively stroking, just allowing the water to carry them. Someone brought a lantern to the railing. This was a logical thing to do, and whoever did it was likely trying to resolve the question as quickly as possible. But the lantern did not help. The light it cast onto the water was warm and orange and illuminated a circle of surface perhaps 2 or 3 meters across, and by the time the lantern reached the railing, the shape had moved out of that circle. Or it had descended. Or it had simply moved in such a way that the lantern caught only the edge of it, which is what Petros says happened. He says he saw briefly the faint impression of something pale just at the boundary of where the lantern light reached, and then it was gone into the darker water below. There was more than one. That became apparent within a few minutes. Another man on the port side said quietly that he could see something there as well, and when the group moved to look, the same description applied. Elongated, pale, moving without a clear swimming motion, just beneath the surface. And then a third man, still on the starboard side, said that something had surfaced briefly. Not broken the surface, not leaped, just risen to it, and he had seen what he described as a length of hair spread across the water for a moment, before whatever it belonged to sank back down. The detail about the hair appears independently in both Petros's testimony and in a secondary account written by another crew member whose name is partially illegible in the surviving document, but whom historians have tentatively identified as a man from the island of Naxos. Both men describe the same thing. Long, dark strands spread across the water surface, not floating in a clump but spread outward, the way hair floats in still water when a person is floating just below the surface facing upward. Both men say the hair was gone within seconds. No one spoke loudly during any of this. The crew had moved to the railings in small clusters, 4 or 5 men together, and they were looking down into the water with the particular stillness of people who are watching something and are not yet certain what the appropriate response is. The singing had not stopped. If anything, it had become steadier, more consistent, less like something carried on the wind and more like something that was simply present, surrounding the ship on all sides. The lantern was brought from one railing to the other, again and again, and never once caught anything clearly. Whatever was in the water seemed to understand the edge of the light. The crew tried to ignore it, but the sounds began affecting them. It is difficult to talk about what happened next without sounding as though the account has moved into territory that a reasonable person would reject. But it is worth pointing out that this particular element of the encounter, the claim that the sounds carried language, is not unique to this crew. It appears in similar accounts from other sailors in the region from the same general era, and it is a detail that, once heard, is almost impossible to attribute to simple misidentification of ordinary noise. The change seems to have occurred gradually. The singing had been melodic and wordless for the first part of the night, or at least no one had identified anything in it that resembled speech. But somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd hour of the encounter, 2 men independently told the captain that they were hearing words in the sound, not complete sentences, not clear declarations, but something embedded in the melody that sounded, to them, like names. Petros is measured about this in his testimony. He writes that he himself was not entirely certain. He says that the sound had a quality that made him feel it was directed at him specifically, not at the group, not at the ship, but at him, and that when he concentrated on it, he thought he could hear something that resembled the sound of his own name. He is careful to say he could not be sure. He acknowledged that a person listening intently for something familiar will often find it, even where it does not exist. But he also said that the feeling of being called, regardless of whether it was real, was unlike anything he had previously experienced. It was not alarming in the way that a shout is alarming. It was the opposite. He described it as a feeling of recognition, of responding to something that had found you specifically. One of the younger sailors, a man Petros refers to in his testimony only as the boy from Rhodes, had to be physically restrained. He had walked to the starboard railing and was standing at the very edge of it, leaning slightly over the water, in a posture that none of the other men present interpreted as accidental. He was not crying or agitated. He was simply standing there, looking down, with an expression that Petros described as concentrated, as if he were trying to listen more carefully, and the railing was an obstacle to doing so. When one of the other sailors touched his shoulder, the young man turned around slowly and looked at the group with what Petros described as a momentary blankness, as though he had been somewhere else and the touch had brought him back. He did not say anything for a while. When he eventually did speak, he said only that he thought someone in the water had been calling his name. He said it the way a person states an observed fact, not the way a frightened person insists on something. The captain at this point gave a firm order. No one was to stand at the railing alone. Everyone was to remain in the center of the ship. If anyone felt compelled to approach the edge, they were to say so immediately, rather than act on the impulse. Valles delivered this order without shouting and without explaining himself, which is, in many ways, more telling than if he had. He was not dismissing what the men were experiencing. He was managing it. 2 other men admitted, when asked directly, that they had also felt something they described as a pull. Not physical, not a force, but an inclination, a persistent and irrational desire to go to the railing and look into the water. Both men said they had resisted it without difficulty, but that the desire had been real. The tension escalates when the figures appear closer than before. The encounter reached its most concentrated point sometime in the hour before dawn. The sky had not yet begun to lighten, but the darkness had taken on that particular quality it takes on in the hour before first light, when the stars seem to recede slightly and the darkness becomes more absolute before it begins to break. This is the hour when the human body is at its lowest, when sleep deprivation is most felt, when the boundary between reasonable interpretation and panic is at its thinnest. The crew had been awake for hours. They had remained together on deck, and they had kept away from the railings as best they could. But the shapes in the water had not retreated. If anything, they had become more numerous and more visible. The flat water around the vessel still held, and in that stillness the pale shapes were easier to see than they had been earlier in the night. Petros counted what he believed to be 4 distinct shapes on the starboard side alone, moving in the same slow, drifting manner as before, but now closer to the surface. In the least opaque layer of the water, the shapes were defined enough that several men could confirm seeing the same things at the same time, in the same locations. The singing was different now. It had lost the quality of distance it had carried through the earlier part of the night. It was not louder in any way that could be measured by volume alone, but it was immersive in a way that sound is not normally immersive in an open outdoor environment. It seemed to come from directly beside the ship rather than from out on the water. And it was multiple voices, or something that functioned like multiple voices, layered in a way that was not quite harmonious, not quite dissonant, but somewhere between the two. Several men said afterward that it had been difficult to think clearly during that period. Not that their thoughts were obscured, but that maintaining focus on anything practical required effort that it did not normally require. The moment that broke the crew's composure, such as it was, happened at the stern. One of the older sailors, a man who had said almost nothing throughout the entire night, was standing near the stern railing when he stumbled. It is unclear from the accounts whether he slipped, whether he leaned too far, or whether something happened that none of the others could directly explain. What the other men saw was him suddenly at a significant angle over the water, both hands gripping the rail, his body past the point of balance. 2 men caught him and pulled him back immediately. He was unhurt. He stood on the deck and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked at the captain and said nothing. Valas did not wait. He went directly to the helm and altered the course. Not a gradual adjustment, but a definitive change in heading, away from the corridor they had been passing through and toward a more open stretch of water to the north. He gave the order to put on as much sail as conditions allowed. The wind, which had been cooperative all night, held, and the ship began to move with more purpose. The shapes did not follow immediately, or at least the men watching the water could not confirm that they had. The water alongside the hull remained flat for a time, and then, as the ship moved further from that particular stretch of the corridor, the normal movement of the sea returned. The swells came back, slow and low, and the surface lost its mirror quality. The singing continued for some time after the ship had moved. It did not stop abruptly. It faded the way a sound fades when its source is genuinely receding, gradually losing definition, losing the quality of nearness, until it became something that could be attributed to the wind or to imagination. As the ship moved away, the sound slowly faded. The crew arrived at their destination 2 days later. The logbook records the delivery of cargo without comment. There is no dramatic notation about what had occurred. The entry for the night of the encounter remains the one brief line about unusual sound and no source identified. Valas did not file any formal report with port authorities. He did not mention the incident in any correspondence that survives. By all visible measures, the voyage concluded and the crew dispersed as they normally would. But there are things that did not return to normal. The route through that corridor in the southern Aegean was, by several accounts, never used by Valas again. He began taking a longer heading on subsequent voyages between the same islands, one that added several hours to the journey and offered no practical advantage in terms of wind or current. When younger sailors on later voyages asked about the alternate route, the older men who had been on the 1903 voyage gave answers that were evasive in a way that was itself communicative. They did not say there was nothing to worry about. They said only that the other route was better. Petros wrote his testimony at the request of a man he describes as a researcher interested in maritime folklore of the region. The researcher's name is not given. The testimony was written in a measured hand and delivered in person, and Petros notes at the end of it that he was not seeking to be believed, only to give an accurate account of what he had witnessed. He says he has no explanation for what he heard or saw. He does not invoke the word siren anywhere in the document. He does not invoke mythology at all. The mythology, however, was already there. The waters between the southern Cyclades and the northern coast of Crete carry one of the oldest concentrations of siren lore in the Mediterranean world. Ancient accounts place the Sirens in this region specifically, in waters that are deep and relatively still and far enough from major shipping lanes that travelers passing through them were, historically, isolated. The folklore is not uniform, and it does not resolve into a single clear picture of what the Sirens were or what they wanted. But the elements repeat. Singing with no visible source, water that behaves unusually, a pull toward the edge, and the persistent sense of being addressed personally by something that does not have a face you can look at directly. The sailors on the 1903 voyage never claimed they had been attacked. They never claimed that any harm had been done to them. What they claimed, in the careful language of men who were not comfortable with the subject, was simpler and in some ways harder to dismiss. They said that something in the water had tried to bring them closer, and that they had barely chosen not to go.